Good afternoon, everyone. Gita, I just want you to know that we're the last session, so we're also the only thing standing between the attendees and our happy hour closing session. So let's make it really good. Okay, I'm thrilled to be here today in conversation with somebody who has worn many hats, an investment banker, former trade minister of Indonesia, visiting scholar at Stanford, and to win cool points with the Gen Z crowd, he's an influential YouTuber and the host of the Endgame podcast with over 1 million followers. Gita Wirjawan has been one of the region's clearest voices on how Southeast Asia can grow on its own terms while still playing big on the global stage. So today, what we're going to talk about is how we can rethink economic leadership from a regional perspective, especially in this fractured world, and what bold leadership will look like in the times ahead. Okay, Gita, let's start by zooming out. I think in recent times, you've been talking a lot about the shift from a bipolar to a multipolar world. Can you go a little bit deeper on this concept and why you think that's the most accurate description of the geopolitical state today?
Thanks, Maria. Thank you. Tech in Asia for inviting me to be here. I think the shift really would have been from a unipolar to a multipolar type of world order. The unipolarity, I think, was quite pervasive ever since the early 1990s, where the United States was able to tell just about everybody what to do, what to say, and what to write. And that kind of shifted as soon as the previously small developing economies became much larger. And they became somewhat revisionist to the pre-existing order, and this became multipolar. But I think the multipolarity that would have started unleashing in early 2000s has shifted from a rather unstructured fashion to a much more structured. And this would have been on the back of the shock and chaos that would have been perpetuated by the isolationist tendencies of the United States and others that tend to want to project their nationalist tendencies. And this, I think, has somewhat allowed us to better define as to who is an enemy, who is a friend, and who is a swing state. I'm in a camp that believes that Southeast Asia deservedly is a swing state, by way of the fact that we are a 700 million people community. We are a $4 trillion GDP community. And we've got the ability to basically swing between China and the West. And this is, I think, inherent in our history, but also in our future. And we see China increasingly as a technological capital allocator, not because we see China as a 0 to 1, but I think we see China increasingly as a 1 to the next digit, whereas the US, which would have been the preeminent 0 to 1 technological capital provider, but it's just too darn expensive, right? Because we're dealing with a region that is so divergent, economically speaking. You've got Laos that basically earns less than $2,000 per capita per year. You've got Singapore that earns $91,000 per capita per year. By way of that divergence, I think the optionality is solidified as for us to basically go to China for technological capital allocation and the US for economic capital allocation. This is sort of like my inkling in terms of how we should position ourselves geopolitically in this new kind of structured multipolar world order.
Okay. When you say swing state, I'm American, so I naturally think of swing voters, right? Like the ones in Iowa. And the benefit of being in a swing state and being a swing voter is that actually both parties end up courting you. And so does that mean that ASEAN as a region is going to come into a lot more leverage at the negotiating table than has been previously available to us?
I don't think so. And you know, Liberation Day was what, on April 2 this year? And you all would have witnessed that Southeast Asia decided to not reciprocate on the back of this principle of reciprocity. And it may have been construed as capitulation by Southeast Asia, but this is largely on the back of two accounts. The first is that our being cognizant of the fact that we don't have the kind of marginal productivity that China has. The second is our ability to think long-term. Whatever episode that we're going through with respect to the US is episodic, it's not secular. And we believe that the long future of Southeast Asia with the United States is going to be robust, at least economically, right? Now, if we take a look at the collective trade between Southeast Asia and China, that's about $900 billion to $1 trillion, depending on which publication you look at, and it's growing at an accelerated rate. Whereas the collective trade between Southeast Asia and the US is about $520, $530 billion. So in my view, the train has left the station in terms of our collective trade with China. That number is going to go up at a faster rate, especially on the back of this principle of reciprocity that's being imposed upon us by the United States. Now, how does the US government, catch up with whatever velocity that this train has already left the station with in terms of our collective trade with China, or Southeast Asia's collective trade with China? I think they need to recognize the fact that the goods and services from the US are not coming as quickly as those coming from China. It's not because of tariff. It's just because it's too darn expensive.
Yeah.
It's just not as competitive as the technological goods and services that would have been coming from China. So I do believe that the reindustrialization narrative of the US government is somewhat misplaced. And I think if they take a view on investing on the vocational skill sets in the US and the tertiary skill sets, the way China has been doggedly investing in the last 30 to 40 years, I think they will have a chance of reindustrializing in the next 10 to 20 years, but not in the next 2 to 3 years. So I think we've got to be deft in navigating ourselves economically or geoeconomically and geopolitically with respect to China and the West.
Okay, can I summarize? So, our trade as a region with China is basically 2x what it is, or almost 2x what it is with that of the US. Yet, ASEAN as a region still remains a swing state. What are the benefits of being a swing state, and what are some of the challenges that we would have to navigate in balancing between China and the US?
I think in simple terms, on one day we could choose to buy an Oppo, on another we could choose to buy an iPhone. And we're not going to be pushed to the corner as to just choose one or the other.
Okay, so
right?
there's a plethora of choice
That's
here.
optionality.
Yeah, okay.
And in corporate finance terms, optionality is worth a lot more than not having optionalities. So, and I think we need to recognize that 700 million people is a lot of people. That's 9% of the global population. $4 trillion worth of GDP is probably the 5th or 6th largest GDP in the world after US, China, European Union, Germany, and Japan. So that gets recognized. The reason why we're not being recognized the way we should be, given the fact that we're the 5th or 6th largest GDP in the world, we're the 3rd or 4th largest population in the world, is because we don't tell stories. We're not narrating our narrative as well as we should. Southeast Asia, in my view, is one of the most, if not one of the more under-narrated regions in the world. And to put this in the context of publications, if you Google the number of titles that would have been published year to date or up to today until the beginning of, from the beginning of time, it's about 140 million titles of books, of which no more than 300,000 books or titles are written about Southeast Asia. So think about this. If the population of Southeast Asia makes up about 9% of the global population, the number of books about Southeast Asia doesn't even make up close to 1% of the total number of books. It just says that we're not telling the stories. Yeah. Not to mention, most of those 300,000 titles are written by non-Southeast Asians. So I would urge the Cambodians, the Myanmarese, the Laotians, the Vietnamese, Filipinos, Bruneians, Malaysians, the Thais, not the Singaporeans, and the Indonesians, to basically tell the stories a lot better than what we have been doing. The Singaporeans are just the LeBron James. They know how to project soft power to the world much better than all the other 9 countries in Southeast Asia.
So on the storytelling aspect, I mean, yes, the individual countries, but then who within the individual countries is it? Are we talking about the institutions, like the investors who are going out there to fundraise and seek FDI, the politicians? Like, who do you think is responsible for telling those stories? I mean, I'll tell you from the Tech and Nation Business Times perspective, we're trying our darndest, right? Like, we're out here. But I mean, I'd be curious to see, like, where do you think that responsibility lies, and who can tell our story the clearest and the best?
Well, the entrepreneurs in Southeast Asia have taken the bold steps telling the stories, right? It doesn't resonate to as many people as it should. The way perhaps the Chinese, the way the Koreans, the Taiwanese, the Japanese, and the Europeans have told their stories. And I think it takes people in positions of leadership, not just in policy making, not just in politics, but also in entrepreneurship, in academia. Public intellectuals need to go out there and tell the stories. And I think there's a discount to the narrative to the extent that the stories are only being told by the Singaporeans, right? I think the way you reduce the discount is to actually diversify the storytellers so that you get a broader based narrative narrating by Southeast Asians to the rest of the world. And I think this could happen in the next 5 to 10 years, given the fact that we have recognized, put this in the context of how the GDP per capita in China in the last 30 years has grown by about 10 times compared to Southeast Asia's GDP per capita having grown only 2.7 times. This would have been on the back of 4 attributes, identifiably. The first is the underinvestment in education. Second is the underinvestment in infrastructure. The third is the lack of optimal intersection between power and talent. We call that governance. And the fourth is the lack of competitiveness. So I think the elites in Southeast Asia recognize that. To the extent that we take a view on each one of these 4 attributes, game on.
Okay, against those 4 attributes, how would you rank us? I mean, we're behind, but like, where do you think we're slightly ahead amongst the 4 attributes? Where do you think that you see actual government policy institutions working to actively change the situation within the next few years? And where do you think like we haven't even really started scratching the surface? Education.
I think that's the most.
We're way behind.
We're way behind.
Okay.
I mean, Singapore is way up there on a different planet, but the others, they need a lot of catching up to do. And I'm in a camp that believes that if you follow the ASEAN Charter, it's the charter that basically promotes the 3 pillars, socio-cultural, political, and economic. It is written with what they call the principle of subsidiarity. What it means is ASEAN was designed and concocted as to not be intervening, not to be interfering, unless there is anything that relates to its wherewithal to withstand and deal with global challenges. And I'm in a camp that believes that the investment in education has to do or correlates with our ability to deal with global challenges. So I think there needs to be some sort of a revision to that pre-existing principle of subsidiarity so that perhaps in the near foreseeable future, ASEAN could just tell, hang on, we've got a great education system in Singapore. How about we copycat it for the Bruneians, the Laotians, Cambodians, Vietnamese, Indonesians, and all the rest. And we can probably have some sort of a differential timeline for each country. Maybe the Thais will need 7 years, Indonesians 8 years, the Laotians 11 years, or whatever. But we have a set, well-defined target so that the educational attainment of all countries or each country in Southeast Asia is at par. And that, I think, is going to create a massive geopolitical capital for Southeast Asia. To the extent we don't take a view on stuff like that, it's manifested in the economic divergence. The fact that Laos has not invested in education the way Singapore has, it's manifested in the fact that Laos has a GDP per capita of $2,000 and Singapore $91,000, Indonesia $5,000.
Let's take Indonesia as an example. I mean, the thing about education is, on the one hand, every policymaker is like, duh, right? Like, we need to invest in the future, talent, so on and so forth. So why do you think this is still such a gap in terms of the investment? Because, I mean, like, again, you look at India, they're graduating, like 1.3 million STEM.
1.4.
Okay,
STEMs.
right. Yeah, every year, right?
Right.
Insane. So, like, this is not a new story. It's not like, oh, wow. So why are we here? What's gone wrong?
Look, education relates to three attributes. The first is technology, the second is curriculum, the third is teachers. I'm a traditionalist. I believe in the quality of teachers, irrespective of the curricula and the technological empowerment. If you've got a great teacher that can incite imaginative capabilities in the students, I think that's what it takes to educate somebody. The problem is in Indonesia, we're only paying teachers about $200 a month. Singapore is paying about $4,000 to $5,000 a month. So Singapore has been doggedly serious about recruiting teachers from the top percentile, 10 to 20 percentile. South Korea is on a different planet where they recruit from the top 5 percentile. Indonesia, well, all the top percentiles are going to work in tech in Asia. Amazon, Google,
I hope
McKinsey,
so.
Goldman Sachs. You know, so we get the bottom of the echelons of the pyramid, and these are the people that are supposed to teach the next generation.
Yeah.
So, and they're being paid $200. If they would have gone off to tech in Asia, the requirements would have been very different. And this is, I think, a systemic and structural issue that needs to be remedied. And I believe that, you know, I'm vocalizing this to as many people as possible so that there is a cognizance of the problem. And I do believe that in the near foreseeable future, we're going to see some meaningful changes to the way we take a view on education.
I mean, actually, as you're speaking, I was thinking about the U.S. educational system, which, you know, has been good, but right now teachers are in a very much similar kind of position where it's like kind of a leftover thing and not that many people are excited to go into it. Okay, let's move from trade to capital. FDI is another topic that you talk about quite a lot. So foreign investment is still flowing into Southeast Asia, but it's obviously becoming increasingly competitive to get a share of that pie. So you've stated before that one of our biggest challenges as a region is to be, in terms of attracting FDI, is not necessarily the lack of opportunities, but the inability to translate uncertainties into priceable risks. Can you just opine on that for a second? What do you really mean by that? And yeah.
I was just trying to sound smart. but
Nice.
You know, if we take a look at the numbers, Southeast Asia gets about $200 to $230 billion worth of FDI every year, of which Singapore consistently gets about 100 to 140 billion. Indonesia lately has been getting about 30 to 50 billion dollars per year. Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, and Philippines each would be getting about 10 to 20 billion dollars. The reason why Singapore has been able to get disproportionately more FDI than the others is not because of ideology, not because of geography, not because of whether or not there's natural resources. It's simply because of their ability to enforce whatever that needs to be enforced. It's called the rule of law, the clarity and certainty of law. You've decided to live in Singapore because you believe in that certainty, predictability. The narrative is predictable. So, many of us in the global south are filled with uncertainties, right? Uncertainties are unknown unknowns, whereas risks that can be actually measured, predicted, quantified, and priced, they can actually attract capital. As long as you're a triple B, triple C, double B, triple A, single A, you can price it.
Right. And
capital will attach to it. Given the fact that there's about $140 trillion worth of liquidity sitting in the West, mostly the US and its G7 friends and its Middle East friends, there's about $140 trillion. Given the fact that there's a rising risk premium in places like the US, there is an inherent desire to diversify, to reallocate capital. They're not allocating or reallocating capital to places like Southeast Asia because we do not have the ability to translate unknown unknowns into known unknowns. Risks are known unknowns. I'll give you a very simple example. If you're talking to a guy that's about to invest $100 million in a factory in Subang, and if somebody in Subang or Indonesia can tell that potential investor there is a 68% probability that there's going to be no electricity for about 2 weeks in a year, and the impact of that will be about 12% decline on your top line, 18% decline on your bottom line. That's what I call known unknown. The second scenario is somebody wants to invest in East Java, want to build a factory, and want to put down $100 million and talks to the guy in East Java, and he goes, what's going to happen? Well, inshallah, hopefully there's no blackout. That's what I call unknown unknown. right? So I would go with scenario number 1 as opposed to scenario number 2. You have just lifted yourselves up from the level of not being able to translate uncertainties into risks to a level where you can actually translate uncertainties to risks. This is what I think members of the Global South need to understand. So the homework for all of us to attract massively more FDI into Indonesia or other parts of Southeast Asia outside Singapore is number 1, to basically uphold whatever that needs to be upheld. That's rule of law. The second is to increase our wherewithal to translate uncertainties into risks.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the market is very good at pricing basically anything as long as it knows what it's pricing. And then there's always somebody willing to buy, again, anything as long as they know that it's a known unknown, if you will. And then when we're talking about FDI, I think the other thing that's kind of historically plagued the region is this idea, or lack of, I mean, FDI is FDI, money is money, right? But then dumb money versus smart money. And then so when you think about attracting smart FDI, ones that really build the technological capabilities of the region, that bring in like high quality jobs, how do you think that the region can do a better job of really kind of getting the smart money in the door, and maybe less of this like low value manufacturing kind of work?
Well, smart money came to Southeast Asia in a big way 10 to 15 years ago. But the reason why we're having a tech winter, because at that time the narrative was such that, well, from 2004 to 2014, the GDP per capita in Indonesia in dollar terms grew by about 220%. The fact is, the last 10 years, it's only grown by about 40 to 50%. So there hasn't been as much of a robust buying power increase in the last 10 years, or even 15 years, as much as there would have been in the preceding 10 years. And if you take a look at the tax revenues in Indonesia, the last 10 years, it's only grown by a factor of about 40 to 50%. Whereas the preceding 10 years, it grew by more than 300%. So the institutions that were supposed to basically grow the purchasing power of the government and the purchasing power of the individual has not backed up the narrative that was narrated to the fund managers, to the VCs that basically deployed a lot of economic capital to this region 10 to 15 years ago. So, well, where's the revenue generation? Where's the margin? So the revenue generation got narrated or re-narrated into something called GMV, right? Then the margin was questionable, much less the bottom line. But I do see a very different future where I think there's a recognition amongst the elites in Southeast Asia that, look, at the end of the day, we've got to amp up the buying power of the constituents or the populace. So if we want to move up the value chain from the bottom echelon to the top, we've got to invest again in education, tertiarily and non-tertiarily. Here's the score. The PISA scores for Southeast Asia are such that there's only 2 countries that have scored above the global average. Singapore, again, number 1 in Southeast Asia, number 1 in the world out of 81 countries. Vietnam, that was still in a war until 1975, is already number 2 in Southeast Asia, I think in the top 20 of the world. Indonesia, which became independent in 1945, is number 69 out of 81 countries on PISA. PISA is the measurement of the lingual proficiency and STEM proficiency for the 15-year-olds. So if you're a CEO of a multinational company that wants to install an EV factory or something that's moving up the value chain, you've got to look at the scores in terms of the vocational skills. But if your PISA scores are such that you're number 69 out of 81 countries, I think you'll think twice about investing. That's at the non-tertiary level. At the tertiary level, you've got 8,000 universities in Southeast Asia with 19 million students. 8,000 universities, 19 million students. China has only 2,600 universities with 39 million students. Look at their scores. China has got a few universities in the top 20. Southeast Asia only has 2 universities in Singapore that are in the top 20 in the world. The other 9 countries don't have any university in the top 20. Indonesia, well, let's not talk about that. But I think at the end of the day, if we want to move up the value chain, you've got to take a view on the non-tertiary and the tertiary. And I'm in the camp that believes that the investment thesis is not absolutist. It's all about directionality. If you can convince somebody in Mountain View, you can convince somebody in Shenzhen that tomorrow is going to be better than today, the day after is going to be better than tomorrow, a week after is going to be better than day after tomorrow, I'm going to put money to this. Whether you're in Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, Brunei, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, or Singapore. That's the way to go forward. You tell that story and you back up that story with data. And if that data or set of data show that you're moving in the right direction, I think the investment thesis can be held accountable.
Can we double click on what you said earlier about, there was a lot of smart money being deployed. And then so in your view, it's that we told too big of a story too early? Like we told that story too early on, and actually the region was not in the right state of development in order to actually fulfill that. Do you think that's what went wrong? And then, now, because actually to go back to your point about narrative and storytelling, actually the people telling that story were the GPs, right? Like the GPs were going out around the world and fundraising from the LPs and telling a great story, but yeah, maybe it was just the wrong tale to tell at that point in time. And do you think that we've reached a, materially different point in time, and it's now that it's an okay time to tell that same story?
They took the Kool-Aid,
yeah,
right? And they kept drinking.
Kool-Aid tastes so good.
That Kool-Aid, without actually recognizing that the directionality was in a different fashion from the past. And I think what they could have done with the benefit of hindsight was to actually just pinch yourself a little bit and tell the story differently. This is probably not going to move the way that we had told you 15 months ago. And I'm not aware of anybody that was daring enough to tell that story in a bold and candid manner, because they were drinking that Kool-Aid too much. I'm not blaming anybody here, because it was just so easy. And I want to make the point. There is $140 trillion worth of liquidity that has to be reallocated. And if you want to approach that money, you better approach it judiciously. You better tell the story candidly and truthfully about what's happening on the ground and what steps you're going to be taking so that you can have a different kind of directionality going forward.
Okay. To switch gears a little bit, Trump had recently had a very splashy trip to the Middle East. They talked a lot about, there were the two levers of like using AI and technology and kind of using it as a lever of diplomacy, which is quite new, right? And now, to your point about Southeast Asia being a swing state, we're also talking about like when you're building out a tech stack in the AI space, it could be a Chinese tech stack, an American tech stack. So how do you think the region can, and individual countries can kind of best play this new hand that they've been dealt and use AI to maybe jump themselves up the value chain or to dramatically change the situation that we've been in?
If you were to do a simple search on ChatGPT, Gemini, or Grok, most people don't realize that the amount of energy used is about 10 to 50 times compared to a simple search on Google.
Right.
If you try to create a sophisticated AI-generated image on Sora, most people don't know that it requires about 1,000 to 5,000 times more energy than a simple search on Google. So at the end of the day, it's all about electrification. Right? I think the most structural limitation with respect to the advancement of AI in any place, Africa, Asia, Europe, United States, it's all about electrification. The US is endowed with lots of energy and lots of grid capabilities, but there's double the amount that's basically waiting to get in line compared to what is in the pre-existing grid. Southeast Asia only has 2 countries that have electrification per capita at about 10,000 kilowatt hour per capita. The rest, below 6,000. Malaysia at 5,000, Indonesia 1,300, the Indochina countries less than 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita. For a nation to be modern, just a typical baseline, it needs to be at about 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita before it AIs itself to the level that we're seeing in Shenzhen, to the level we're seeing in Mountain View or wherever in Silicon Valley. So until and unless we take a view on moving that needle up from 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita to 6,000, here's the math. For Southeast Asia, as for everybody to be at 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita, we need to build a terawatt. A terawatt worth of power generation capabilities at a cost of $2 million per megawatt. We're talking about $2 to $3 trillion that's needed So let's get real here. The realism of the AI narrative is that until and unless we energize ourselves, we're not going to be able to use Sora as much as we want to. We're not going to be able to use Gemini, Grok, or ChatGPT the way we want to because the energy requirements are massive. So we need to figure out to get $2 to $3 trillion so that everybody in Southeast Asia is adequately electrified at 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita. And you want to know the math in Indonesia? We've been building 3,000 to 5,000 megawatts per year. In order for us to move the needle from 1,300 kilowatt hour to 6,000, you know how many years it's going to take? If we only build 3,000 to 5,000 megawatts per year? More than 100 years. So get real, guys. If we want to be a modern nation, we're going to need more than 100 years. So the way to improve upon our pre-existing order is to build more. We need to build at least 15 to 20,000 megawatts of power generation capabilities per year. Hopefully, most of that is renewable.
Yeah.
So that we can actually check two boxes, modernization and sustainability.
Okay, how do we get there? Actually, why is it so slow in terms of electrifying Indonesia? Is it a regulatory thing? Is it a capacity thing? Is it a technology thing?
It's not a technology. It's not a technology thing. The technology is there for renewabilities.
Yeah.
The problem is for any renewable technology to make money or just break even, it needs to be able to charge at least 15 cents per kilowatt hour. Developing economies, call it the 84% of the planet, who earn less than $13,205 per capita per year, they can only afford 5 cents. So you've got to wait until that 5 cents goes up to 6, 7, 8, 9, and that 15 cents comes down to 14, 13, 12 until such time they intersect. So we need somebody at Wall Street to figure out a derivative product that would be able to allow us to take a view while those two things do not intersect. It's actually a new product. So this is, I think, being cooked up by some smart people at Wall Street. But until such time, I think we're just going to have to just say, well, let's just use coal for the time being.
Well, how do you feel about nuclear?
I love nuclear. I've been quite vocal about nuclear. Nuclear is proven to be the most clean and the most safe. People don't know that the casualties as they relate to fossil is like 7 million per year by way of the relevant diseases that people suffer from, whereas nuclear is less than 3,000 to 4,000 per year. And you could look at the data. The radioactivity of nuclear is not as hot, not as high as people have sort of like bigified it. I'm using a Trumpian term here. So the way forward, and you're aware of the fact that the data center people are talking about SMR's capability, small modular reactors, and the Singaporeans are talking about this, the Americans and the Chinese are talking about this. I think inevitably we're going to have to go on that route.
Yeah.
So nuclear and other, but again, technologically it's available, but it's expensive.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to figure out how to pass it on to the customers or do it at a wholesale level, where the wholesalers, I think, can take a view, then they can figure out and repricing it so that the end user can stomach it.
Okay. I mean, yeah, because what you see, the charts these days, it's like China's bringing on a new nuclear reactor site like once a week or once a month, or it's like an insane pace, and because they're obviously anticipating the additional energy usage that they'll have in order to continue to power their nation and all their developments. So do you think nuclear has a real shot in Southeast Asia, and specifically in Indonesia?
I think so. Well, our president has articulated his open-mindedness with respect to nuclear. Recently in St. Petersburg, and his younger brother who attended Baku in Azerbaijan at the last COP, I think he articulated the open-mindedness with respect to not only decarbonization, but the possibility of using nuclear technology.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
I'm pro-nuclear too. It'd be awesome to see. Okay, to close this out, let's go into a few rapid-fire questions. Although actually now I feel like I know how you will respond, so I almost feel like I should count to 3 and we say the same word at the same time. But anyways, what do you think is the biggest blind spot you see in the region's current policymaking or private sector strategy?
Education.
Yep. We should have played this game.
I mean, it's an obvious, but we're not doing anything about it meaningfully.
Yeah. If you had the pen and unlimited funds for, whatever, a year, where would you invest the money? How would you divvy it up?
I mean, I like agriculture, but I also love education. So I'm investing most of my time in education now. That's where I would pen myself into.
Well, on the education route, like how rapidly do you think it's changing with AI? And then because I think that the issue with education is like, it's something that people don't want to touch because you don't really know how it's going to break, and it takes such a long period of time in order to understand like maybe your policy or your educational system wasn't quite the right one. And I do think AI is really disrupting the game as well. And so like how should how can you set educational curriculums in order to both incorporate AI, but then also still generate the talent, the critical thinking skills that you actually need in order to carry it forward?
Well, at the most fundamental level is the energy sufficiency, right? For us to be able to embrace AI. But I think episodically we can take a view on certain sectors. I think in the context of education, I'm very much interested in moving the productivity level upward. Indonesia's marginal productivity on a PPP adjusted basis is only $25,000. Singapore's is above $200,000. So how do we figure out a way so that Indonesia's marginal productivity would go up disproportionately from 25,000? And I think AI can play a significant role in that. And Indonesia cannot just be a fixed income story. It has to be an equity story. An equity story could only be substantiated by the right investment in education so that we can increase our marginal productivity much more meaningfully.
All right. And what does the end game look like for Southeast Asia? What's your big vision that we're all building towards?
I think once more than 4, 5 countries pierce through the middle income trap, which is not an impossibility, I think it's a real probability in the near foreseeable future, I think we're going to be able to see Southeast Asia being able to deal with the world in arm's length in a palatable manner. And I think the real homework for Southeast Asia is to improve upon a pre-existing intra-trade. We don't intra-trade with each other. The intra-trade, meaning the extent to which we trade with each other, is only about 22 to 23% of our collective GDP.
Yeah.
We actually trade with the world much more than we trade with each other. What does that tell you? We don't communicate with each other. We don't do things in a complementary manner. We do it too much in a similar manner. Why? Because maybe some countries have big egos. They want to do something better than whatever you're doing similarly. So I think that needs to be remedied if we want to be standing where we want to be standing by 2045. And it's real, guys. By 2045, we're still going to be the 3rd or 4th largest economy in the world, but hopefully we're going to be a lot more relevant. We're going to be able to expand upon our strategic autonomy. We're going to be able to move up the value chain. We're going to be able to move up the geopolitical global order the way we deserve to.
And do you think this current moment in time with Liberation Day and everything that's happening around the world, do you think that it's like a beacon call for stronger interregional trade? And do you think people are going to rise to the occasion?
In the near foreseeable future, no.
Okay.
If we're talking about the next year or two, that's not going to happen. I think we're looking at BRICS, China, as a destination and source for diversification purposes. But I think in the midterm and long term, yes, absolutely.
Okay. All right. Let's check out some audience questions. Okay, these are all top voted. So many ASEAN nations promote national tech champions. How can the bloc reconcile this with the goal of an integrated regional market? Okay, so I guess this is a question of like individual nationalistic champions versus a broader regional story.
Well, nationalism is trendy nowadays. We're seeing that in Europe, we're seeing that in China, we're seeing that in the US, we're seeing that in some countries in Africa, we're seeing that in Southeast Asia. And I think you need to understand that there's 4 economic phenomena that are taking place, staring at us. The first is the inequality of wealth. The second is the rising inequality of income. The third is the rising inequality of opportunities. And the fourth is the centripetalism of economic development, meaning there is a higher acceleration of economic growth in the primary cities vis-a-vis that in the secondary cities, much less regional cities. Until and unless those 4 economic phenomena get remedied, conversations will get polarized. to the left or far left, to the right or far right. The guys that have to campaign on the far left, they have to campaign with a message of hope. When you campaign on a message of hope, you got to be credible. But as soon as they find out that you plagiarized when you were a sophomore in college, there goes your credibility. So it doesn't benefit those that are campaigning on the left, whereas the guys on the far right, they campaign with a message of fear and intimidation. Vote for me, because if you don't, they're going to rape you, they're going to loot you, they're going to rob you. They get away. They don't have to show credibility. So the political calculus is shifting to the right. The geopolitical calculus is shifting to the right. And this is why we're seeing a much higher degree of projection of nationalism or nationalistic fervor. So I think we're seeing that already in Southeast Asia. So it's not going to help in terms of promoting integration of economic activities for the time being. But I think if one leader, big leader in Southeast Asia, or two big leaders in Southeast Asia get together over coffee or whatever, dude, we got to do it differently. Let's do it for everybody. I think that's what it's going to take. When those two guys get together, then the third, the fourth, the fifth will join in, and I think we'll have a much broader-based narrative.
Do you think those conversations are happening?
Absolutely.
All right, good to know. Okay, this one's a bit more about Indonesia's narrative. What story do you think Indonesia should be telling the rest of the world about itself? That's not currently telling, of course.
Let me start off with Southeast Asia. If you walk from Tanwe to Merauke, Tanwe is the westernmost town in Myanmar. Merauke is the easternmost town of Papua and the easternmost town of Southeast Asia. We're talking about 5,000 kilometers. That's equivalent to the distance between LA and Boston. If you walk from Nok Mung, the northernmost town of Myanmar, of Southeast Asia, to Boa, which is in West Rote, the southernmost town of Indonesia and Southeast Asia, we're talking about 4,000 kilometers. That's equivalent to the distance between Tehran and London. The immensity of Southeast Asia doesn't get narrated to the world enough. Indonesia is the most immense part of Southeast Asia, with 280 million people making up about 43% of the population, making up about 43% of the GDP. So I would urge Indonesians to just become better storytellers. And I think that's what it takes. All it takes is probably about 20 to 30 community multipliers that can actually tell stories the right way, truthfully, candidly, to anybody in Africa, in Europe, in China, Japan, the US, South America, and all that. Once we get to that point, I think credibility is established. Once credibility is established, I think people realize that Indonesia is not just about Bali.
Fair enough. I'm also really impressed by your command of geography for the region. Okay.
Well, I read. I don't do TikToks.
That's pretty. I was just imagine you on like Google Maps, like zooming and okay. So since Southeast Asia mainly plays the role more of consumers, what actions do we need to take in order to shift that to be more on the productive role, or to shift that to take on more of a productive role?
Well, you don't translate yourselves from being a consumer or being consumptive to being productive without investing in non-tertiary education and tertiary education.
Yeah.
And that's what's going to help you increase productivity. If you increase productivity, you will increase production. If you increase productivity and production, you will increase your ability to be less consumptive and be more productive. And this is what China has been able to do so excellently in the last 40 years. And paradoxically, China as an autocracy has been able to democratize talent a lot better than most democracies around the world. Yeah. Where most democracies around the world have been not so good in democratizing talent because they've been choosing talent a lot more based on patronage and or loyalty as opposed to meritocracy. Logic or intuition, there's no reason for us not to be able to achieve an 8% growth if we improve upon the pre-existing ability to enforce the rule of law and also be able to translate uncertainties into risk. So this is mathematically and realistically doable.
You know, throughout this conversation, I've been trying to think about, like, how would you describe your approach to Indonesia and Southeast Asia's growth? Do you feel like you're an optimist, a pragmatist, a realist?
I'm glass half full.
Glass half full?
Yeah. I'm not glass half empty.
Okay. And so as you're talking about rule of law, investment in education, investment in energy, it is with the, we are making progress towards this, but we need to do a lot more.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. I would say I'm picking up slightly disappointed dad from you at times in these comments. Okay. Could the high cost of the U.S. tech scene be an opening for Southeast Asia to forge its own third path for technology independent of U.S. or Chinese influence?
Say that again?
Could the high cost of the U.S. tech scene be an opportunity for Southeast Asia to forge its own third path?
Not at the moment.
Okay.
I think we have to understand the U.S. is very much a 0 to 1. We're not going to be able to substitute or replicate that.
Yeah.
If any, I think we're going to be able to just embellish upon the pre-existing 0 to 1. But we're not going to be able to embellish the way the Chinese have been able to do that. So I think we have to be incrementalist, in a lot of ways. Not to mention, there is hope for us to actually game change the narrative, but I think we cannot be overly ambitious about stuff like this. I think the midterm and long term, I think it's more realistic. And I do believe that, Indonesia, I think, is ripe for just copycatting certain best practices from China and other places for the time being before we start thinking of ourselves as a 0 to 1.
Yeah, because the things you're talking about are still quite foundational at the end of
Correct.
the day. And so you're like, let's get the basics down right first. I mean, I would say, especially in the AI space, people are excited about like local application of international, global technologies, right? Because those use cases are very specific to this region. And so there's some real excitement there, but at the end of the day, we have to build a stronger foundation to begin with.
Absolutely.
All right. How do we as individuals contribute to the overall narrative of Southeast Asia? What can individuals do?
If I'll use Indonesia, there's probably no more than 10 million people that speak good English. If we move that needle to about 100 million, if we've got 100 million people in Indonesia that speak good English, game on.
Yeah.
Southeast Asia has probably about 70 million people that speak good English, including 6 million in Singapore, probably about 20 million out of the 33 million in Malaysia, probably about 50 million in the Philippines out of the 120. So if we move the needle from about 70 million to about 300 to 400 million people in Southeast Asia out of the 700 million people, game on.
Yeah.
Why English? Because 80% of wisdom or knowledge is documented in English. LLMs are documented or written in English. And 80% of the economic activities around the world are still done in English, not Mandarin, not Japanese. You still have to learn Mandarin, but I think for the most part, I think we got to pick up English because that's the language, unfortunately or fortunately, that's being used to transact and economize and also technologicalize. If we want to learn, if we want to economize, we've got to learn the language that's relevant to those two activities.
Yeah. Actually, one thing that you said, so a few years ago, Tech in Asia, we launched a podcast and we were talking to the Spotify team. And the Spotify team at that point was like, to launch an English language podcast not based in basically the US means that you're really limiting yourself. And actually where you'll find a lot more traction is launching a Bahasa-based podcast because obviously there's a large captive market that only speaks Bahasa. And on the one hand, I think that's true, depending on how you look at it, that's true if you're trying to grow your readership and your viewership and you're looking for sponsors effectively. But on the other hand, I think that's actually quite limiting because that means that you're telling your story within the echo chamber to people who kind of like are already friendly listeners, if you will, as opposed to people who actually know nothing about it. How do you feel about that in terms of like your own work as a content creator and a podcaster?
Well, that gels with my analysis. I mean, I used to write a lot of music. I used to promote a lot of musicians. Problem is, most of the musicians I groomed could only sing in Bahasa. But the problem with that is that you can't universalize that. You can't internationalize that. You can't listen to a song with a subtitle. Then I shifted to movie making.
Would disagree.
Huh?
The K-pop industry would disagree.
Well, yeah, but they use English words, right? Once in a while,
true.
right?
They'll
Baby, love, whatever, right? So I shifted to movie making, and we just released this cool movie called Jumbo which finally hit 10.3 million, seats, more than the hottest horror movie, which I hate horror, and it just proves that we can actually. We've just signed with I think 32 countries to, distribute the movie, and we can use subtitles. And movies that are based on family themes, romance, or history, they're universal.
Yeah.
You can show them in Africa, you can show them in the US, you can show them in China, you can show them in Russia, they'll relate. Because this is what happens to my home, right? And you can just have subtitles. So I think at some point we've got to come to the recognition that we've got to be able to internationalize our narrative. The simplest way to do that is to just do it in English, because most people, unfortunately use English.
What's Jumbo about?
Jumbo is about a kid who's fantasizing. I mean, he lost his two parents, and he keeps meeting up with his parents in his fantasy or in his dreams. And it's highly educational about what an upbringing of a kid should be and what a parental role ought to be. And it relates to, I think, people in Nebraska, people in Hangzhou, people in Timbuktu, or whatever. And that's, I think, the kind of cultural value that we've got to instill in people.
Lovely. All right, last question from the audience. So going back to the investment theme, Chinese investments have definitely been making its way to Indonesia, agreed, but it also seems like with time we are getting economically invaded by them. What are your thoughts?
I'm not worried.
Okay.
If I take a look at the data on Belt and Road Initiative, which was initiated in 2013 for Southeast Asia, it was supposed to be for about $800 billion. The realization thus far, after 12 years, is about $75 to $80 billion. It speaks of, I think, the structural limitations of China to export capital. Technologically, yes, but economically, no. Right? And this dovetails back to Xi Jinping's dual economic circulation philosophy, which essentially would have meant the increasing of the domestic consumptive propensity. I mean, we've seen China as being able to increase its domestic consumptive propensity in a big way from 30-something% to 50-something% at the expense of their ability to export as a ratio to the GDP. So their exports to the GDP ratio has somewhat declined, which essentially means their less ability to export economic capital because the foreign exchange as a ratio to the GDP is declining. So on the other hand, you've got to take a look at whether or not China can popularize their currency. The renminbi only represents about 5% of the SWIFT landscape. The US dollar has actually increased from 44% to 49%. Euro has slipped down from 30-something% to less than 30%. Yen is still pretty stable at something, I think 20-something%. So until and unless China can popularize the renminbi for international usage, their ability to export capital is somewhat limited. I'm not saying they're not able to export capital, but I think their exportation capability of economic capital will be structurally limited. But it doesn't mean that their technological capital exportation capability is not going to be limited. Why? Because they make a lot of technological capital and it's so much cheaper than what the Americans and Europeans are doing. So yes, they've been at the bottom of the echelon of the pyramid, touching Indonesia for nickel, bauxite, and all that good stuff. I think that's going to carry on, but if we take a look at the big picture, I don't think we need to be afraid of the invasion of China from a capital deployment standpoint. I think we've got to take advantage of that technological capital allocation, but keep in mind the US and the West have massively much more liquidity than China.
I'm going to ask a slightly cheekier question on this one, but obviously, what's happening with TikTok and Tokopedia is quite sad to see, I think, within the startup space, right? And so I think you can talk about the invasion of Chinese capital, but then this is also a good example of are they really, when you think about not just Chinese investment, but really how they're coming into Indonesia, being forced to partner with a local partner, but then what they ultimately do you think that there should be a little bit more restrictions and restraint on that?
Absolutely. We can get into that, but I think there's pros and cons to this. The pros would have been the massive subsidization for the end users.
Okay.
Right? I think the middle class and the lower middle class have benefited by being able to buy cheap products. The cons, of course, numerous.
Yeah.
The cons is that we're not able to produce. We're much more able to consume,
Yeah.
right? And it kind of crowds out, the local entrepreneurship, which is unfortunate. But it goes back to our structure, or economic structure. Our money supply to GDP ratio is only about 45%. A developed economy's money supply to GDP ratio is above 200%. Singapore is above 200%. Our fiscal or tax ratios, which is the ratio of the tax revenues to the GDP for all Southeast Asian countries, range between 10% to 16%. A typical OECD country's tax ratio is about 33%. So if we recognize the fact that we have limited economic spaces, then we've got to be careful about allowing money and technology coming in. That's sort of like the argument that we need to strengthen and assert going forward. I think the regulators could have done a little bit about some of these inflows so that they don't just spoil the customers or consumers, but they need to actually help the society in moving up the value chain. That, I think, is the homework going forward.
All right. Thank you, Pak Gita, for the vision, the clarity, and your long-term perspective. This conversation reminds us that growth isn't just a numbers game, it's ultimately a leadership game, and I do think that the region's leaders have some fairly hard decisions and big investments that hopefully they'll be making. If you want to catch more of Pak Gita, you can check out Endgame on YouTube, or wait for more details on his book about Southeast Asia that you're publishing later this year. Do you want to give us a sneak preview? What should we expect?
Yeah, I just finished writing a book at Stanford. I just got back about a week and a half ago. It's being copy edited as we speak. We'll get it out hopefully in the next couple of months. I think it's a fun read because I don't write well and it's simple.
Amazing. Okay, I could not think of a better speaker or higher note to end the Asia Economic Summit on. So, Pak Gita, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.